Martin Guptill and I had been best friends since childhood. Through thick and thin, we always had each other's backs. There wasn't a single prank in the book that we hadn't pulled. But to be fair, we never aimed to harm anyone. Our absolute favorite mischief was dressing up as ghosts to terrify the locals. Soon enough, a rumor spread like wildfire across our European countryside that the area was haunted by vengeful spirits. Hearing those rumors, Martin and I would share quiet, wicked chuckles. Life was an absolute blast back then. One day, we got an invitation to a wedding at my maternal grandparents' estate in a neighboring countryside. Since Martin was my partner in crime, I told him he had to come along. He hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. On the designated day, my entire family set off. I couldn't pull off any pranks on the way because my mother was sitting right next to us. The wedding venue was bustling with people, and the atmosphere was incredibly lively. At lunch, both of us ate to our heart's content. My mother and the rest of the family planned to stay at my grandparents' estate for a few days. However, Martin and I decided to head back home early on our own, knowing that our usual mischief wouldn't fly around my strict grandparents. When I broke the news to my mother, she surprisingly agreed without a fuss. She smirked and said, "Fine, just go back home. The absolute chaos you two cause. You won't be able to pull that off here anyway." I sometimes wonder how my mother could read our minds so perfectly. To top it off, she even gave us cash for our travel expenses. We left my grandparents' estate late in the afternoon. On the way, we figured that taking a commercial bus or a cab would wipe out most of the money she gave us. We realized that if we could save that cash by skipping the fares, we'd have a neat little sum to fund our future pranks. So, we decided to hop on a train and sneak aboard without buying tickets. After all, beating the system was half the fun. As soon as we reached the train station, a train pulled away from the platform. Even after a desperate sprint, we missed it. I walked up to the station office to ask when the next train would arrive. The man behind the glass stared at us for a long moment, his eyes widening curiously. Then he spoke up, "Traveling without tickets, aren't you? Don't worry. When I was your age, I used to ride the rails without a ticket all the time. Just wait a bit. There's another train coming right after dusk. You can catch that one." Martin and I were completely taken aback by his reaction. We expected him to cause trouble or call security when he figured out our plan. But he did the exact opposite. Just as the evening twilight settled in, a train rolled into the station. The counter agent walked up to us and whispered, "Hey, the train is here. Hop on quickly, it won't stay at the platform for long." Though bewildered, we quickly boarded the train. The moment our feet hit the floor, the train bolted forward. The carriage was strangely empty. The few passengers inside were all slumped in their seats, nodding off in a deep, eerie lethargy. It felt incredibly bizarre to see everyone so profoundly exhausted just as night was falling. Shrugging it off, Martin and I found an empty row and sat down. A man sitting across from us gasped in sheer shock when he saw us, but he didn't say a word. Within seconds, he slumped back and went back to his unnatural slumber. The train was hurtling down the tracks at a furious speed. The windows were wide open, letting in a violent, chilling gust of wind. Then, without warning, the entire train suffered a massive, violent jolt. Before we could even process what was happening, our carriage, along with several others, screeched off the tracks as the bridge underneath plunged into the dark waters below. Martin and I completely gave up on surviving. The carriage was submerged entirely underwater. I scrambled frantically, but there was no way out, and I had no idea where Martin was. Water forced its way into my nose and mouth, suffocating me. I was staring directly into the jaws of death. Suddenly, out of the murky darkness, a crowd of unfamiliar figures floated over and surrounded me. Their faces were horrific beyond words. Some had bloated cheeks with eyes bulging out of their sockets, while others had necks swollen to monstrous proportions. In unison, their voices echoed directly inside my head. "We drowned and died just like this, and this has been our torment ever since. The same fate awaits you. Prepare to die." My surroundings dissolved into total darkness. When I finally regained consciousness, I found myself sitting side by side with Martin on a moving bus. My entire body was dripping wet, and when I looked at Martin, he was in the exact same condition. We couldn't comprehend what had just transpired. One moment we were on a train plunging into a watery grave, and the next we were sitting on a bus. Nevertheless, ecstatic to have cheated death, We both breathed a massive sigh of relief. But as Martin began to speak, my blood ran cold. He described the exact same underwater horror that I had just experienced. How was that even possible? How could two people share the exact same hallucination? In this world, anything is possible. I happened to glance over and my heart stopped. Sitting right there was the same man we had met at the train. Station's ticket counter. He looked at us, a sinister, knowing grin spreading across his face. "Anything is possible, boys," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "Anything is possible. Let's see if something even more impossible happens next, shall we?" Martin and I locked eyes in sheer terror. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed through the air. The bus we were riding collided head-on with another vehicle. Our bus flipped violently, rolling 3 or 4 times before plunging into a deep ravine. My head split open and a river of blood began to pour down my face. I looked over at Martin and gasped in horror. One of his arms was completely severed. His skull was severely fractured, and he was writhing in agonizing death throes. I looked down at myself and saw chunks of flesh torn from my legs. The blood wouldn't stop gushing. A blinding, unbearable agony consumed my entire body, making me wish that death would just come and take me. Then, from the shadows of the wreckage, more figures began to crawl and drag themselves toward me, surrounding us once again. These entities were even more gruesome. Some had shattered skulls with exposed brains. Others had their eyes completely ripped out, and many were missing limbs entirely. Witnessing this nightmare in my dying moments sent a wave of excruciating, psychic pain through my head. Unable to bear the torment, my eyes rolled back as darkness closed in on me once more. And right before I lost consciousness, a chorus of voices hissed into my ears. "Now you finally know what real terror feels like, don't you?" They whispered more, but the sounds drowned out. When I finally opened my eyes, I found myself lying in my own bed at home, with Martin lying right next to me. Seeing me wake up, my mother stood over us with a furious, stern expression on her face. "I have never seen anyone sleep like corpses for this long," she snapped angrily. "I've been banging on the door for ages, and you two were sleeping so deeply you didn't hear a thing. I literally had to break the door lock to get in. What kind of hell were you two lost in while sleeping?" Martin and I turned our heads, looked at each other in trembling horror, and whispered, "A very terrifying hell, Mom. A very terrifying hell." It was supposed to be a routine winter journey, but it turned into an endless nightmare. Johnson and Void had been traveling across Europe, capturing scenic landscapes for their travel logs. It was past midnight when they arrived at a remote, dimly lit station nestled between dense, snow-covered pine forests. The air was so cold that each breath turned into a thick cloud of vapor. The platform was completely deserted, save for an old, rusted analog clock whose ticking sounded like a slow heartbeat. "Are you sure the last train passes through here, Johnson?" Void asked, shivering violently as he pulled his heavy woolen coat tighter around himself. "The local guide said so," Johnson replied, checking his phone. Oddly, the screen showed no signal, and the digital clock on his phone was glitching, rapidly flipping through numbers. He said the Midnight Express is the only way to cross the mountain pass before the blizzard hits. Right on cue, a low metallic screech echoed from the depths of the dark tunnel. The tracks began to vibrate. Within moments, a massive, vintage-style steam locomotive chugged onto the platform. It looked ancient, its black iron body covered in layers of frost and rust. The windows of the passenger cars were fogged up, casting a dim, sickly yellow glow onto the snow. Without waiting, Johnson and Void grabbed their backpacks and boarded the nearest carriage. As soon as they stepped inside, the heavy iron doors slammed shut behind them with a deafening thud. The train immediately accelerated, moving with an unnatural, aggressive speed that made the wooden floorboards groan. The interior of the carriage was unsettlingly suffocating. The air smelled of old paper, damp earth, and something faint but metallic like dried blood. There were about a dozen other passengers scattered across the wooden booths. But something was deeply wrong with them. They were completely motionless. No one was talking, no one was scrolling on their phones, and no one turned to look at the newcomers. They all stared straight ahead into the empty air, their faces pale and hollow under the flickering, buzzing overhead lights. "Let's find an empty compartment," Void whispered, his instincts screaming that they shouldn't stay there. They walked down the narrow corridor, their boots echoing loudly. As they passed a row, Johnson accidentally brushed against the shoulder of an old man wearing a tattered trench coat. The man's head snapped toward Johnson with mechanical rigidity. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of pupils, just a milky blank white. "The ticket has already been punched," the old man rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping against concrete. "There is no getting off at the next stop." Johnson stumbled back, terrified. Void grabbed his arm, and they practically ran down the corridor until they found an empty coupe. At the very back of the train, they slid the door shut and locked it, both breathing heavily. "Did you see his eyes, Johnson? What kind of messed up train is this?" Void gasped, panic rising in his chest. "Calm down, man. Maybe he's just blind or mentally ill," Johnson tried to reassure him, though his own hands were trembling. He looked out the window to distract himself. Outside, the darkness was absolute. The snow-covered trees had vanished. Instead, the train seemed to be flying through a void of pitch-black emptiness. Occasionally, flashes of distant, crimson lightning illuminated the landscape, revealing that the train wasn't on a mountain. Past it all, it was traveling along a narrow, crumbling stone bridge over an endless, bottomless abyss. Suddenly, the overhead light in their compartment flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate knocking sound came from the window. Johnson's breath hitched. They were traveling at a breakneck speed over a chasm. It was impossible for anyone to be outside. Void slowly turned his flashlight toward the window. The beam of light pierced the glass, revealing a face pressed hard against the outside of the window pane. It was a woman. Her skin was blue and decayed, her long black hair floating wildly as if she were underwater, and her fingers, tipped with broken, bleeding nails, were clawing at the glass. Her mouth stretched open into a wide, unnatural, jaw-dropping scream, but no sound could be heard through the thick glass. Before they could even scream, the knocking started from the other side, the sliding door leading to the corridor. Thud, thud, thud. The locking mechanism began to rattle violently. Johnson threw his weight against the door to keep it shut, while Void held the flashlight. Through the frosted glass of the compartment door, they could see the silhouettes of multiple passengers from the carriage. They were all standing outside, their bodies twisted into grotesque angles, violently throwing themselves against the door. "Johnson! Look at the floor!" Void shrieked. From underneath the seats and through the floorboards, a thick, dark, viscous liquid began to ooze out. It pooled around their boots. It wasn't water, it was dark, foul-smelling blood. The temperature in the room dropped instantly, freezing the breath in their lungs. The shadows of the entities outside the door grew longer, stretching underneath the frame, crawling up the walls like living tar. The whispers began, a chaotic chorus of thousands of agonizing voices, echoing inside their skulls. "You took the ghost train. Your journey ends in the void. Give us your flesh. Join the eternal ride." The glass window behind Void suddenly shattered inward. Freezing wind and shards of glass exploded into the room. A decayed, freezing hand gripped Void's collar, dragging him backward toward the dark abyss outside. "Johnson, help me!" Void screamed, his fingers slipping from the edge of the seat. Johnson lunged forward, grabbing Void's hands. He pulled with all his might, but the strength pulling Void from the darkness was inhuman. At the same time, the corridor door finally snapped open. The pale, pupil-less passengers poured into the tiny room, their jaws unhinging, reaching out for Johnson with freezing, rotten hands. Johnson was trapped between the monsters in front and the abyss behind. His grip on Void was slipping. The agonizing pain of the freezing cold and pure terror overwhelmed his brain. "Let go, Johnson. Save yourself!" Void cried out one last time before his grip failed completely. Void vanished into the pitch-black void below. "No!" Johnson screamed, a wave of pure despair washing over him as the entities closed in on him, their freezing fingers sinking into his skin, tearing at his clothes, dragging him down into the bloody floorboards. Johnson sat up with a violent gasp, drawing a massive breath of air into his burning lungs. He was drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked around frantically. He wasn't on a train. He was sitting on a bench at a bright, modern, bustling train station in the middle of a major European city. It was broad daylight. Announcers were talking over the speakers. Travelers were rushing by with their luggage, and the sun was shining brightly through the glass roof. Sitting right next to him was Void, calmly sipping a coffee and scrolling through his phone. "Whoa, easy there, Johnson," Void said, looking at him with concern. "You were having a massive nightmare. You were shaking and mumbling in your sleep." Johnson wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, looking at his hands. They were perfectly fine. No blood, no monsters, no freezing void. "Void!" "I had the most terrifying dream," Johnson breathed, a wave of profound relief washing over him. "We boarded this ancient midnight train, and there were these things, and you fell into an abyss." Void laughed, patting Johnson on the back. "See? That's what happens when you watch horror movies before a trip. Relax, man. Our train is arriving in 5 minutes. It's a completely normal high-speed express." Johnson smiled weakly, nodding. He stood up to stretch his legs and walked toward the edge of the platform to clear his head. He looked down at the modern steel tracks. But as he looked closer, his smile faded. His blood ran completely cold. Stuck to the side of the metal rail, right below where he was standing, was a small torn piece of cloth. It was a distinctive blue fabric, the exact material and color of the heavy winter coat Void had been wearing in his nightmare. Slowly, Johnson turned around to look at Void. Void was still sitting on the bench, but he was no longer looking at his phone. He was staring directly at Johnson. His head was tilted at a stiff, unnatural angle, and as the noon sun hit Void's face, Johnson saw that Void's eyes were no longer normal. They were completely blank, milky, and pupil-less. Void smiled a wide, hollow smile and whispered across the loud station, his voice echoing perfectly in Johnson's ears. "I told you, Johnson. The ticket has already been punched." From the distance, the loud screech of an approaching train began to echo, but to Johnson, it sounded exactly like the screaming of 1,000 damned souls.